My name's Grace. If you're looking for a fairy tale, this isn't it. My life has been anything but easy. These days, I'm a microsurgeon, living in a decent house. I've done well for myself, but it wasn't always this way. Let me take you back to the beginning, when life was much harder. I was just 8 years old when my dad passed away. He was the only person who made me feel like I mattered. After he was gone, my mom, Susan, quickly found a new man. Paul, my stepdad, made it clear from day one that he saw me as nothing more than a burden. He never hit me, but his words cut deep. He had a knack for making me feel like I was just in the way. And my mom? She never stood up for me, as if she wasn't even there. Can't you do anything right? Paul would snap at me over the smallest things, laughing too loudly, forgetting the dishes, you name it. Living with him was like being around a ticking time bomb, never knowing what might set him off. When my mom had my little sister Chloe, things got worse. I was excited to have a sister, but Paul saw me as even more of a nuisance. We've got our own kid now. We don't need to waste resources on her, he told my mom, right in front of me. You're just too much, Grace. Always making a mess, always in the way, he'd complain. And my mom? She just nodded, agreeing that I was nothing but a problem. One time, I tore my pants playing outside, a normal kid thing, right? Not to Paul. Look at her, just can't stay out of trouble, tearing clothes now. What's next, Susan? She's a disaster, he'd say. Mom's response, Paul's right, Grace. You need to be more careful. We can't afford to keep replacing your clothes. It felt like every little thing I did was a catastrophe to them. My laughter, my tears, just being myself, it was all too much for them. Even as a kid, I understood that I didn't belong in the picture-perfect family Paul and Mom were trying to create. The feeling of being unwanted grew stronger every day. After things fell apart with Paul and Mom, I ended up at Aunt Linda's doorstep. If I thought things couldn't get worse, I was wrong. Aunt Linda, my dad's sister, had this tough demeanor like she could chew you up and spit you out without a second thought. Great, another mouth to feed, she muttered the day I arrived, scared and unsure of what to expect. Her house was a strict, no-nonsense zone where fun didn't exist. And me? I was about to become the newest inmate in Aunt Linda's house. The rules were clear. Follow orders. Don't screw up, and maybe you'd get through the day without a lecture. But with me being me, that was a long shot. Can't you do anything right, Grace? Was Aunt Linda's usual greeting, especially if I'd done something small like leaving a light on or not making my bed perfectly. One day, I forgot to take out the trash, a cardinal sin in Linda's house. You're just as useless as your mother, she snapped. Can't even handle a simple task. I'm sorry, Aunt Linda. It won't happen again, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But apologies only fueled her anger. Sorry doesn't cut it, girl. You live under my roof, you follow my rules. Got it? Or is that too hard for you to understand? Her words felt like daggers, each one hitting its Paul. It wasn't all bad, though. On days when I managed to stay out of sight, I'd find a quiet corner and escape into books. They were my refuge from the constant criticism. But even that wasn't safe. Reading again, that's not going to get you anywhere. You need to learn something useful, Linda would sneer, as if reading was a waste of time. The worst part wasn't the chores or the strict rules. It was the loneliness. I missed my sister Chloe, and even though Mom and Paul weren't ideal, a part of me longed for something familiar, something like home. But Aunt Linda's place, it felt like a prison. One evening, I tried to cook dinner as a peace offering. I wasn't a chef, but I thought spaghetti wouldn't be too hard. I was wrong. The sauce ended up everywhere but in the pot, a total disaster. Linda walked in, and her face went from calm to furious in a heartbeat. What do you think you're doing? This kitchen is a disaster. I wanted to help, to make dinner. I mumbled, my attempt at being helpful turning into another failure. Help? You call this helping? You've just made more work for me. Don't ever try this again. You're more trouble than you're worth. She snapped, her words stinging like salt in a wound. That night, I cried myself to sleep, something that had become all too common since I landed in her care. It was clear I was nothing but a burden to her, just like I had been to Mom and Paul. The message was clear. I didn't belong anywhere. The worst part wasn't the chores or the constant criticism. It was the way she made me feel about myself. You're worthless, you know that. No wonder your mom left you here. She's probably relieved to be rid of you. She'd sneer whenever I dared to speak up. I held on to a naive hope that my mom would realize she missed me, that one day she'd come back for me. I used to dream of her showing up at Linda's doorstep, apologizing, and taking me back home. I foolishly believed she still loved me, that maybe she was just too wrapped up in her new family to reach out. One day, desperation took over. I sneaked into Aunt Linda's room and grabbed her phone, my heart pounding as I dialed my mom's number. The phone rang, and I held my breath, hoping for some kind of miracle. Hello. Mom's voice sounded unfamiliar and distant. Mom, it's me, Grace. I miss you, I choked out, tears filling my eyes. There was a pause, a silence that felt endless. Then, Grace, you shouldn't have called. Don't call me again. You don't need me. The line went dead, and so did something inside me. That call shattered any illusion that she cared. I was truly alone. Aunt Linda found out, as she always did. You little thief, how dare you use my phone without permission? She screamed, her face twisted in fury. The punishment was harsh, more for the betrayal than the act itself. That night, as I lay in bed nursing my bruises, both inside and out, a hard truth settled in. My mom didn't love me. She never would. And Aunt Linda's words echoed in my mind, a cruel reminder of my worst fears. No one needs you. After everything with Aunt Linda, I ended up on Grandma Judy's doorstep, my bags feeling like they were filled with rocks instead of clothes. I wasn't sure what to expect. My memories of Grandma were blurry, and Aunt Linda's parting words, "Good luck with her, you'll need it," didn't help. Grandma Judy opened the door, her expression stern, not exactly a warm welcome. "So, you're here," she said, her voice cold, much like Aunt Linda's. "Come in then. We have rules in this house. You'll follow them." The first few weeks were tough. I kept to myself, trying to avoid any trouble. Grandma was strict, her words sharp and unforgiving. Every mistake I made, she was there to point it out. "Can't you do anything right? Your mother didn't teach you much, did she?" She'd snap. But then something changed as the days passed. One evening, while I was struggling with math homework at the kitchen table, she sat down beside me, her tone softer than usual. "Let me see that," she said, taking the pencil from my hand. Math was always my strong suit. It was the first time we did something together that didn't involve a lecture. As we worked through the problems, I noticed something I hadn't seen in a long time, a genuine smile from a family member. "Thanks, Grandma," I said, feeling a warmth I wasn't used to. "Don't thank me yet. You've still got to pass that test," she replied, but the sharpness in her tone was gone. Days turned into months and months into a year. Grandma and I found our rhythm. She taught me how to cook and shared stories about my mom as a child, stories I clung to because they made me feel closer to the woman who had left me behind. "Your mom was wild, always getting into trouble. You've got her spirit," Grandma said one day, with a hint of pride in her voice. During one of our cooking lessons, I finally opened up about how much it hurt to be abandoned by Mom. Grandma listened, really listened, and when I finished, she pulled me into a hug so tight I could hardly breathe. "Your mom made her choices, but they're not on you. You're strong, stronger than you realize, and you're wanted here with me." That was the turning point. For the first time since Dad died, I felt like I belonged somewhere. Grandma wasn't just a relative anymore. She was becoming the family I chose, not just the one I was born into. One evening, out of nowhere, Grandma said, "I've been thinking, how would you feel about making this official? Adoption." I was stunned. The idea of truly belonging to someone again filled me with a mix of hope and disbelief. "You mean it?" I asked, hardly able to believe it. "I've never been more serious about anything," Grandma replied, looking right into my eyes. "I want you to be mine in every way that matters." Turning my life around wasn't easy, but with Grandma Judy's support, I started to see a future for myself, one not defined by my past. Medicine. That was the dream. It sounded crazy at first, even to me, going from feeling worthless to dreaming of becoming a microsurgeon. But Grandma believed in me more than I ever believed in myself. "Medicine, huh?" Grandma raised an eyebrow when I told her, "That's a tough road, Grace. Are you sure?" "Yeah, I am," I said, more to convince myself than her. "I want to do something meaningful, to help people." Grandma nodded, her expression softening. "Then you'll do it, and I'll be right here cheering you on." Getting into medical college was my next big challenge. The books, the late nights, the endless exams. It felt like jumping into the deep end without knowing how to swim. But every time I thought about giving up, I'd remember Grandma's words, her unwavering faith in me. That's what kept me going. The day I got my acceptance letter, Grandma and I sat at the kitchen table, the letter lying between us like a prize. "I knew you could do it," she said, her eyes misty. "I couldn't have done it without you, Grandma," I said, feeling a lump in my throat. "None of that now," she waved it off. "You did the work, kid. You earned this." Medical school was a blur of sleepless nights, relentless studying, and a constant pressure to prove I belonged. I made friends, but I always felt like the odd one out, the girl who had fought her way in from a world they couldn't understand. "Hey, Grace, you coming out with us tonight?" a classmate, Tom, asked one day. "We're celebrating the end of exams." I hesitated, thinking of the mountain of study material waiting for me back at my dorm. "I don't know, Tom. I've got so much to catch up on." "Come on. Everyone needs a break. You aced the exams. If anyone deserves to celebrate, it's you." Maybe he was right. For once, I decided to let go and just be another medical student, not the girl with something to prove. That night, I laughed and danced, feeling lighter than I had in years. But as medical school continued, the challenges only grew tougher. There were times when I felt completely overwhelmed, drowning in knowledge I feared I'd never fully grasp. After one particularly rough day, failing a simulation test, I called Grandma, trying to hold back my tears. "I don't know if I can do this, Grandma. It's just so hard." "Grace," her voice was firm but gentle, "you've faced harder things than this. You're going to be an amazing doctor. Now, dry those tears and get back to it. You hear me?" Her words were like a light in the darkness. I dug in, refusing to let this dream slip away. I studied harder, pushed myself further, and slowly, things began to make sense. The day I graduated, Grandma was in the front row, her face glowing with pride. "I told you, didn't I? My granddaughter, the doctor," she said, pulling me into a hug that felt like home. "Thanks, Grandma," I whispered, holding back my tears, "for believing in me when no one else did. Always, Grace, always." Graduating from medical school was a huge milestone, but it was the internship that truly tested me. Long hours, tough cases, and the constant pressure to prove I belonged. Whenever I felt like I was drowning, I'd remember what Grandma Judy taught me about strength and perseverance. "Remember, Grace, it's not about how hard you hit. It's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward," she'd say, her voice a steady presence during those grueling nights at the hospital. Our conversations, whenever I could steal some time away, were my lifeline. We'd sit in her kitchen, sipping tea, as I shared every detail of my day, each success and setback. She'd listen intently and offer her words of wisdom. "You're doing important work, Grace. Healing others, that's a noble path, she'd say, her eyes sparkling with pride. In those moments, I felt like I could conquer anything. But life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. Just as I was finding my footing, feeling like I was making a real difference, Grandma Judy passed away. It was sudden, a shock that left me reeling. She was my rock, my family, and suddenly, she was gone. Organizing the funeral was one of the hardest things I've ever done. I wanted it to be perfect, a tribute worthy of the incredible woman she was. But as I looked around the chapel, I realized something heartbreaking. There were no blood relatives there, just friends, colleagues, and the many lives Grandma Judy had touched. It was a stark reminder of how alone I truly was in terms of family. Yet, as I stood there delivering the eulogy, I felt a strange sense of strength. Grandma Judy had prepared me well. She taught me to face the world without her, and to do so with grace and courage. After everything, it's just me now, I said, my voice steady even as tears threatened to fall. But I carry a piece of her with me in every life I touch, in every decision I make. She was my family, my everything, and though she's gone, her legacy lives on through me. The silence in my apartment was a rare moment of peace, a break from the chaos of my life. Until the knock came, sharp and insistent, filling the room with a sense of dread. I hesitated, knowing deep down that whatever was on the other side of that door wouldn't bring good news. And I wasn't wrong. Opening the door, I was greeted by the all-too-familiar faces of my past. Susan, my mother, with that practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes. Paul, my stepfather, barely hiding his disdain behind a thin layer of politeness. And Schlo, my half-sister, looking awkward and out of place. Mom didn't waste any time. Grace, darling, we've missed you. It's been too long, she said, her voice sugary, the false affection grating on my nerves. I couldn't help but chuckle. Really? Because it feels just right to me. So, what brings you here after all these years? Paul jumped in. Cut the crap, Susan. We're not here for a family reunion. We're here about Judy's inheritance. The mention of Grandma Judy's name made my chest tighten, a mix of grief and anger swirling inside me. Mom couldn't hide her greed. Grace, we're here for our share of Judy's things. It's only fair, she said, her voice dripping with entitlement. I scoffed at her nerve. Fair? You're talking to me about fair after 19 years of silence. She bristled at that, her eyes narrowing. Don't be ungrateful, Grace. You've done well for yourself, and with Judy's inheritance, it's only right you share. The laughter that escaped me was sharp, almost bitter. Ungrateful. You left me, remember? I owe you nothing. Their audacity was mind-boggling, a harsh reminder of the pain they had caused. Mom's face tightened, a mix of anger and something else, maybe shock. You're rich now, a successful doctor, and Judy's inheritance. You must give us our due or we'll take this to court. We'll claim alimony. That's when I dropped the bombshell. Good luck with that. Judy adopted me, legally. You're nothing to me now. The color drained from her face, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Paul's face darkened, his posture stiff as he stepped closer, his voice low and threatening. You think you've won? You'll regret this, Grace. You haven't seen the last of us. But I wasn't scared of them anymore. I've faced worse. I'm not afraid of you. Now, please leave my apartment, I said, my voice firm. In the wake of my family's shameless demand for a piece of Grandma Judy's inheritance, I naively thought that chapter of my life was over. But I was wrong. Their audacity knew no bounds. They had moved into Judy's house as if it was their birthright. Mrs. Henderson, the watchful neighbor, was the one to break the news to me, her voice laced with concern over the phone. Grace, dear, I thought you should know. There are people living in your grandma's house. It didn't seem right not to tell you. Fueled by a mix of anger and loyalty to Judy's memory, I went to confront them. They were lounging in the living room, acting like they belonged in a place that wasn't theirs. "What the hell do you think you're doing here?" I demanded, keeping my anger in check. Paul, ever the provocateur, sprawled on the sofa with a smirk that made my blood boil. "Oh, look who decided to show up. We're just making ourselves comfortable, since we're family and all," he sneered, dripping with unwarranted entitlement. Their audacity was unreal. "You're no family of mine, and you don't belong here. This is my property, legally left to me by Grandma Judy. You need to leave now," I fired back, refusing to back down. Mom, with her twisted sense of reality, jumped in. "Don't be so dramatic, Grace. We're just here for what's rightfully ours. Judy would have wanted it that way." Her attempt to twist Judy's wishes was pathetic. "You have no idea what Judy wanted. You weren't there for her. You have no claim here. And if you don't leave, I'll call the police," I warned, my patience nearly gone. The threat hit its Paul. Paul stood up, trying to intimidate me with his size, but those tactics didn't work on me anymore. "You wouldn't dare," he bluffed, but his confidence wavered. "Try me. You have until the end of the day. If you're not out by then, the authorities will be here," I said, my voice resolute. They realized then that the scared girl they once knew was gone, replaced by someone they couldn't bully. They left, not in triumph, but with the realization that they had underestimated me. As they drove away, I felt a mix of victory and exhaustion, drained from dealing with their relentless greed. For a few days after, a sense of peace began to settle in, but that calm was shattered by a call from Mrs. Henderson. "Grace, dear, you need to come over. Someone's broken the windows at your grandma's place." I rushed over, and the sight of the shattered glass was a harsh reminder of my family's spite. "I bet it was Paul," I muttered, my suspicions voiced without proof. Mrs. Henderson, ever vigilant, offered a glimmer of hope. "You know, I've got those cameras installed. They point right over here. Maybe we caught who did it." Together, we reviewed the footage, the grainy images revealing the unmistakable figure of my stepfather, stones in hand, malice in his every move. With the evidence in hand, I made my next call to the police. I explained the situation, my voice steady, the proof undeniable. "I have video evidence of my stepfather vandalizing the property. He's caused significant damage." The officer on the line was sympathetic, promising swift action. "We'll take care of it, ma'am. We have enough to bring him in." True to their word, the police acted, and Paul was detained, finally facing the consequences of his actions. Faced with the threat of legal repercussions, my mother and stepfather did what they always did when cornered. They disappeared. In the aftermath, the silence at Grandma Judy's house felt different. It wasn't the oppressive silence of abandonment, but the peaceful quiet of resolution. The broken windows would be repaired, not just as a physical fix, but as a symbol of my own healing from years of neglect and manipulation.